So finally, on the 11th of November 1918, thanks to attrition, we finally reach an end and the guns fall silent on the Western Front. But they don't fall silent everywhere, they don't fall silent for long, and Ireland is just one of many examples of what you've called the Greater War.
Yeah, that's right. Churchill used the very dismissive term, the Pygmy Wars. He said in November 1918, he said the Great War is over, but the Pygmy Wars are beginning. It was a typically Churchill throwaway remark, but he had his finger on the pulse of something, which is that, as we know, the official hostilities had ended earlier in parts of Eastern Europe with the Russian Revolution. But this then was metamorphosed into civil war, into a paramilitary violence, into wars between emerging nation states, which went on until 1923. And the center point of that violence was the former Eastern Europe, precisely where the dynastic empires had disintegrated. Historians have coined the term shatter zones for that area. And this was where political legitimacy of different kinds was struggling. New nations were trying to establish ethnically coherent borders, which was impossible in that part of the world. And there was also, working its way through it, the effects of class revolution in Russia. I think we had a much milder version of that in Ireland, but it was nonetheless directly comparable. That we also had a contest over the legitimacy of the state. We had paramilitary violence, and this violence in Europe really lasted until 1923. From that point of view, I would say that the real peacemaking wasn't the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. That was actually the summit of the war. And the real peacemaking occurred in the second half of the 1920s, in the Locarno treaties, Germany coming into the League of Nations, the first proposal for a federal states of Europe, proposed by the French foreign minister. And this period pivoted on Franco-German reconciliation, in many respects foreshadowed the European project as it emerged in the 1950s. But the impact of the Depression, the unresolved questions of the wars, and then the rise to power of Hitler in Nazi Germany upended it all and produced a very different scenario in the 1930s.
Proving that whole thing about the 20 years armistice.
The 20 years armistice, the 30 years European civil war. And yet, I think what both of those ideas leave out is the way in which the aftermath of the war, the paramilitary violence, the attempt to build new utopias, it's as if it translated the violence of the war and all of those things. I mean, the First World War set in motion far more than it could resolve, and those were translated into politics. And it was as if they became supercharged in politics, and Nazi racism is a very good example of that. And then they were retranslated into military violence 20 years later in 1939, which explains why the Second World War is even more violent than the First World War.